Almost everything is unimportant. Only a very few things are truly worth our full attention. This statement isn't meant to offer comfort. It cuts straight to a familiar feeling in modern life, the feeling of always being busy, yet rarely feeling like you're heading in the right direction. Essentialism, the disciplined pursuit of less by McKeown, doesn't come across as gentle advice. This book poses a challenge. If you can't do everything, why keep trying as if you must? The book isn't about tidying up your to-do list. It fundamentally questions a deeply ingrained assumption. The more you do, the greater your value. Through sharp observations and real-world experiences, the author points out that this very mindset erodes our energy, focus, and ability to choose. When everything is deemed important, nothing truly is. What makes this book unique is that it doesn't encourage escaping the busy world, but rather confronting it directly. Confronting commitments made without thought. Confronting choices made purely to avoid awkwardness. Confronting the truth that many efforts are being wasted on things that create no lasting value. Essentialism doesn't promise an immediate, lighter life. It offers a different path where clarity is prioritized over busyness, where refusal becomes a vital skill, and where people learn to protect what's essential through deliberate choices. So, if almost everything is unimportant, what in life truly deserves our full time and attention? And if we could only keep a very few things, would we be brave enough to let go of the rest? Now, let's begin this book review together. That day, I received an enticing invitation from one of the world's largest companies. It was for a high-level meeting where decisions were made that could change an entire industry. I had dreamed of that moment for so long, being there, having a voice, being valued. But ironically, it coincided exactly with my wife going into labor. I had to choose, go or stay, and I chose to stay. People thought I was crazy. Opportunities like that only come once. But for me, some things, once lost, cannot be recovered by any meeting. That choice didn't just alter my career path, it awakened something deeper within me. Modern people don't live by what they choose, but by what others implicitly choose for them. We grow up with phrases like, you must, you should, everyone does it. Then one day, we believe we have no right to choose anything anymore. But that's the most dangerous lie. Because even when you don't choose, you are still choosing to give up, choosing to let others decide for you. The power of choice never disappears, we only deny it. People often mistakenly think they are forced, that work expectations and deadlines are shackles, but no one forces you to check emails at midnight. No one holds a knife to your back, forcing you to nod yes to every request. We agree because we forget we can say no. There's a subtle yet profound difference between two people. The first says, I have to do that. The second says, I choose to do that. The first lives like a shadow, the second lives like a guide. That's why I started learning to say no. No to meaningless invitations, no to tasks that drain me, no to trying to please everyone. I don't want to live like an execution machine, I want to live like a navigating human being. The cost of not choosing is perpetual confusion. You get submerged in seemingly important tasks, but in the end, you can't even remember what you're living for. You complete your to-do list but feel hollow. You're praised for being diligent but don't feel like you're growing. This world doesn't lack talented people, it lacks people who know how to choose. Because those who choose are those who dare to make trade-offs. They understand they can't have everything, that every yes means giving up something else. And they aren't afraid of that. They are afraid of living an inauthentic life. I once thought more opportunities meant a richer life. It turns out, more choices often lead to more confusion. What builds character isn't the ability to multitask, but the ability to let go of things that pull you away from what's essential. I started focusing on less, but more deeply. I chose to read one good book slowly instead of skimming a dozen. I chose to spend quality time with loved ones instead of just checking in. I chose one thing that ignited me instead of 5 that exhausted me. If you're feeling lost, it might not be because you're lazy, it might be because you're doing too many wrong things. Look back, not to blame, but to re-choose. This life isn't a pre-written plan by others, it's a blank page where you hold the pen. And sometimes, you need to rewrite everything, starting with a single word, choose. But once we reach the door of choice, a new question opens up. What do we choose in this noisy world? Not all choices carry the same value. The difference isn't in the quantity of information, but in the ability to distinguish what is essential. Between the noise and the urge to react, people are easily drawn into things that seem urgent but are hollow. Someone living an essentialist life doesn't simply know how to say no, they also know how to be silent to listen for what is truly worth living for. Imagine a swift-flowing stream. Each drop of water is an idea, a demand, an opportunity. But only the calm person sees the precious stone lying beneath the stream bed. That is the essential. The hasty one will be swept away by the current. Discernment doesn't come from reaction, but from a process of pausing, observing, and contemplating. One of the vital skills of an essentialist is the ability to see what has long-term importance. They are not fooled by superficial glamour or temporary appeal. They don't chase trends, but seek out things that bring lasting value, even if they don't make an initial impression. I remember once being invited to a large conference under bright lights and bustling sounds. Dozens of speakers shared inspiring lessons. But when I left the hall, I only retained one thing: what makes you pause is often what you need to look at more closely. Not every lesson needs to be written down. Some things aren't on the slides but hidden in the silences between words. Essentialists don't seek more choices, they seek clarity. They ask questions like an investigative journalist. What is hidden here? Where am I being led? Is this truly essential or just a feeling of being pushed? And once the right questions are asked, all distinctions begin to emerge. Essentialist thinking is a kind of mental filtration, sifting away temporary attractions to retain what moves you deeply. A music producer once told me, "What's important isn't the loudest drum beat, but the silence between two drum beats. Those spaces create the depth of the music." Life is the same. If you don't have room for silence, you'll never hear your inner voice. Essentialists aren't afraid to miss out on good things to pursue what is absolutely worthwhile. They know that the more choices there are, the easier it is to get distracted. But clarity doesn't come from adding, it comes from daring to eliminate. Once I was having dinner with a famous entrepreneur. When I asked him what allowed him to make the right decisions amidst countless options, he just smiled and said, "I always ask, if I could only do one thing today, what would I regret missing?" The answer was simple yet profound. It didn't come from intelligence but from honesty. Discernment is not a step, but a way of life. You cannot live essentially with just one decision. You must live with a series of commitments. Commitment to reflect, commitment to delve deep, commitment not to be swayed by superficiality. Look at your schedule. How many things on it are truly important? How many are to please others? How many are just habits? Essentialists don't start their day with a to-do list. They start with a question: what is the most important thing? And they dare to ignore the rest. I used to be someone who was always busy, packed schedule, back-to-back meetings, incessant messages. But at some point, I realized that busyness isn't proof of value. Sometimes it's just disguised disorientation. When we fail to distinguish what's essential, we let others choose for us, becoming victims of nameless choices. But once you know what's essential, everything becomes clear, like light shining into a dark room. Essentialists don't do more, they do less but better. And they do it intentionally. No one can do everything, and certainly, no one can do everything well. This seems obvious, yet it's the biggest paradox in the modern world, where we are caught in a whirlwind of versatility, multitasking, and multi-layered responsibilities. Essentialists understand that it's not that you can't have it all, but that you shouldn't have it all. Declining what's unnecessary isn't selfishness, it's self-respect and respect for what's truly worthwhile. Careful selection is the only way to preserve energy for the most valuable things. I once met a man who was always smiling, busy all day, present at every meeting, replying to every email instantly, and always saying yes whenever anyone asked for help. But after just a few months, he was completely drained. The pressure didn't come from doing too much, but from failing to distinguish what was worth doing. He was the embodiment of a generation manipulated by a false definition of productivity. Essentialists don't ask, "Can I do this?" but "Should I do this?" That's the crucial difference between someone who does many things and someone who does the right things. The world doesn't need people exhausted from juggling. It needs clear, decisive, and precise minds. When you start setting boundaries, you'll see the world shift. Others no longer see you as a tool ready to serve at all times, but as an individual with principles. You become less predictable and thus more trustworthy. I remember once being invited to join a large, attractive project. Every element was perfect: reputation, opportunity, finances. But deep down, I knew it would consume all the space for a project I was nurturing, and I declined. It wasn't easy. But later, that very choice helped me write the first chapter of this book, something that likely would never have happened if I had said yes. Essentialists understand that every choice entails a sacrifice, and it is in that sacrifice that new value is shaped. Passing up an opportunity isn't a loss but an act of creating space where truly important things can germinate. Look back at your life. How many things have you agreed to do just because you didn't dare to say no? How many times have you nodded yes out of fear of displeasing someone? How many meetings, how many encounters, how many emails have you responded to, only to realize later that none of it truly held meaning? Essentialists filter carefully. They view time, energy, and attention as their most precious assets, not to protect them, but to invest them wisely. They don't seek to fill their schedules, but to leave gaps for creativity and depth. They don't rush to answer questions because they know that sometimes silence is the smartest reply. There's a question I always ask myself whenever I feel overwhelmed by too many choices. If I weren't bound by fear or guilt, what would I choose? That question might sound simple, but it's a compass for every difficult decision. An essential life doesn't come from doing less, but from living with purpose. It doesn't advocate minimalism just to be lighter, but to be stronger, not to avoid, but to confront oneself, one's true values, and the responsibility of choice. We cannot please everyone, but we can live in a way that doesn't betray ourselves. I realized something quite late in my life. It wasn't when I failed, nor when I succeeded, but when I started to feel my mind was constantly noisy. Not external noise, but internal noise. Hundreds of thoughts running in parallel, dozens of overlapping obligations. Each day passed so quickly that I couldn't remember what I had truly thought for my own soul. People don't lack time, people lack space. We live in a world that glorifies constant online presence, always responding, always ready. Anyone absent is considered irresponsible. Anyone slow to reply is seen as unenthusiastic. Gradually, we learn to fear absence, fear silence, fear missing out. And it is this fear that prevents us from ever truly seeing what is important. I used to believe I always had to be present, to grasp every piece of information, to stay updated on every opportunity. Until one day, I realized I knew a lot of things but understood nothing deeply. I reacted quickly but rarely thought profoundly. I was so busy I had no time left to distinguish what was essential from what was merely noise. To see clearly, one must first step back from the crowd. This sounds counterintuitive. Society teaches us to push forward, to dive in, to keep up. But to distinguish the essential, we need a deliberate step back, not to escape, but to observe, not to give up, but to choose correctly. I once met a leader with a peculiar habit. Every week, he dedicated an entire morning to no meetings, no emails, no phone calls, just sitting quietly, reading, writing, thinking. When I asked why he indulged in such a luxury, he simply said, "If I don't protect my thinking space, others will use it for me." When you are always available, you lose the right to choose. Constant availability makes us reactive instead of proactive. We do whatever is asked, we meet every need. When we look back, our schedule is full, but our life is empty. We don't lack things to do, we lack direction. To distinguish the essential requires a prerequisite: intentional detachment. It's not about disappearing, but about choosing when to appear, not about permanent silence, but about knowing when to speak and when to listen. I began experimenting with this cautiously, not immediately replying to every message, not agreeing to every appointment, not jumping into every conversation. At first, I felt insecure, as if I was doing something wrong. But very quickly, another feeling emerged. My mind slowed down, my thoughts gained depth. The truly important questions began to surface. Only in silence does the essential speak. The world is always loud. If you don't actively create space, you will never hear your inner voice. And when you don't hear that voice, you will live according to others' priorities without even realizing it. I don't advocate retreat as a movement. I talk about disciplined, purposeful, limited withdrawal. It's the act of someone who knows what they're looking for, not to merely rest, but to observe carefully. Someone who never leaves the current will never know where they are going. When you dare to create distance, you begin to see things that were previously obscured. Meetings you thought were important turn out to be just habits. Noisy conversations turn out to bring no lasting value. Commitments that exhausted you turn out to have never truly been necessary. I began to understand that prolonged busyness is not a sign of value, but often a sign of a lack of selectivity. When everything is prioritized, nothing is truly important. Stepping back isn't giving up, it's rechoosing. And only when you have rechosen can you move forward consciously, without rushing, without being pulled along, without being defined by others' pace. This isn't a call to live slowly, it's a call to live clearly. Clear about where you are, clear about where you are headed, clear about what deserves your time and attention. When you are brave enough not to always be present, you truly begin to be present in your own life. Stepping out of the crowd is just the first step. If we only stop at creating space, we only have air. To breathe deeply, we need to learn to see, not to glance, not to see in order to react, but to see in order to understand. Most people look a lot but see very little. We are used to being pulled along by big signals. What is noisy gets attention. What appears constantly is deemed important. Gradually, the ability for subtle observation erodes. We react to the surface without ever touching the underlying structure. And when we only see the surface, every decision becomes fragile. I once thought observation was an innate ability. It turns out it's a skill that must be trained, just like reading. If you only skim the words, you'll never understand what the author is saying. Observation is the same. If you only look at things as they appear, you'll never see what they conceal. Essentialists don't see more, they see deeper. I learned this in seemingly ordinary conversations. Some people don't say much, but every question they ask changes the room. They don't ask to show off their knowledge, they ask to dissect the essence. While others are busy debating, they remain silent. While others rush to conclude, they wait an extra beat, and that waiting beat makes all the difference. Observation requires patience. You must accept that what's important rarely appears in an obvious form. It often hides in small details, in repetition, in things others overlook because they deem them insignificant. The essential often speaks very softly. I started training myself in a new habit. When faced with a problem, I don't immediately ask what to do. I ask, what is truly happening? Who benefits? Who is affected? How many times has this repeated? And if I don't act, what will continue to exist? These questions don't provide quick answers, but they provide the right answers. And only when you get used to observing before acting will you escape the loop of unconscious reactions. Reacting quickly does not equate to deep understanding. For a time, I spent many hours just rereading old notes, not to memorize information, but to discern patterns. When you look long enough, seemingly disconnected points begin to link up. You see what tasks are repetitive but create no value, what small behaviors lead to big consequences, what signals indicate a decision is about to go wrong. Observation also requires courage, because when you look closely, you will see unpleasant things. You will see yourself investing energy into things that lead nowhere. You will see you've grown accustomed to busyness to avoid confronting difficult questions, and at that point, you are forced to be honest. Someone who doesn't dare to look deeply will never choose correctly. I'm not advising you to become skeptical, I'm advising you to become mindful. Mindful enough not to be swayed by fleeting emotions. Mindful enough not to be carried away by false signals. Mindful enough to realize that not everything that gets a lot of attention deserves your attention. When you observe long enough, something interesting happens. Complexity begins to simplify. You no longer see hundreds of options, you see a few clear directions. Not because the world has less, but because you know where to look. Clarity doesn't come from adding information, it comes from eliminating noise. And from that clarity, the next steps have a firm foundation. You no longer choose in confusion, you choose with understanding, without rush, without pressure, not to prove anything to anyone else. When you learn how to see, the world no longer needs to shout to get your attention. You hear what's important even when it's spoken very softly. As the ability to observe sharpens, a paradox emerges. The deeper I look, the more I realize that my mind doesn't strengthen under stress, but in seemingly unproductive moments. This is where many people misunderstand. They believe discipline means strictness, and productivity means relentlessly pushing forward. But the reality is the opposite. Wisdom isn't born from forcing, but from a state of liberation. I once had a phase where I was proud of always being busy, my mind constantly churning. I called it focus. But looking back, it was just a form of fatigue disguised by willpower. I did a lot but achieved no breakthroughs. I tried hard but lacked clarity. And then I realized something so simple it was hard to accept. The brain isn't designed to operate continuously in serious mode. There are times when the smartest thing you can do is allow yourself to play. Not to play to escape work, but to play to reopen the doors of thought that have been locked by pressure. When you play, you're not forced to achieve results. You're not forced to be right. And it's in that non-judgmental state that new connections form. When not forced to prove itself, the mind dares to experiment. I've witnessed this many times. The clearest ideas don't come when I'm sitting at my desk. They come when I'm walking slowly, when I'm flipping through an unrelated book, when I let my mind wander without guilt. That's not laziness. It's a higher form of discipline that allows the mind to restore its capacity for discovery. Many people fear play because they think it makes them lose focus. The truth is the opposite. Play helps us remember our original sense of curiosity. When you're curious, you're not driven by results. You pay attention because you want to understand. And when attention isn't forced, it becomes much deeper. Someone who doesn't allow themselves to play will soon lose the ability to see new things. But play alone isn't enough. There's a deeper, more silent foundation without which all efforts at discernment become distorted. That is sleep, not as a daily habit, but as a strategic asset. I used to think lack of sleep only made me tired. It turns out it made me less clear-headed. The worst decisions in my life were made when I hadn't slept enough. At the time, I still felt alert, spoke fluently, and managed tasks, but my ability to discern almost vanished. I chose faster but made more mistakes. Lack of sleep doesn't slow you down, it makes you choose wrong without realizing it. When you get enough sleep, your brain has space to reorganize information. Scattered details connect, emotions settle. You look at problems with the necessary distance, and that distance helps you distinguish between an immediate reaction and long-term value. We live in a culture that praises staying up late, seeing it as sacrifice, as effort. But in reality, it's often a sign of poor management of the essential. Someone who knows what's important doesn't need to sacrifice sleep to prove their seriousness. They understand that clarity is a sustainable competitive advantage. Sleep doesn't take away your time, it gives you back the ability to choose correctly. When I started getting enough sleep, a strange change occurred. I didn't do more, I did less, but what I did was of higher quality. I was less drawn into things that seemed urgent. I could easily recognize what could wait and what didn't need to be done. Discernment became natural, unforced. Play helps the mind expand, sleep helps the mind sharpen. These two things, seemingly opposite to productivity, are actually the conditions for sustainable essential discernment. You cannot choose correctly if you are always tired. When the body is exhausted, the mind will choose the easiest path. When the mind is too strained, it will choose the familiar path. And neither leads to what is essential. Only when you are sufficiently alert, relaxed, and present can you choose what is truly worthwhile. This isn't advice for an easy life, it's a reminder of inner strength. The strong person isn't someone who pushes themselves endlessly. The strong person is someone who knows when to relax to maintain long-term sharpness. When you allow yourself to play without guilt and sleep without fear, you are protecting your most important asset, the ability to see clearly and choose correctly amidst many good things. How do you choose the most worthy thing to bet on? That's where all observations, all spaces, all recovery converge, and also where decisions become definitive. Once all observations have settled, when the mind is no longer strained by noise, when the body is alert enough not to betray reason, a very clear moment appears. The moment you realize you don't lack choices, you only lack standards. Most people don't choose wrongly because they are foolish. They choose wrongly because they choose in ambiguity. I used to believe that with diligent consideration, good decisions would naturally come. But the more I thought, the more confused I became, the more options, the more I hesitated. Until I understood a simple but stark truth. If you don't set clear standards, every option seems reasonable. We often ask, should I take this opportunity? Should I agree to that proposal? But these are weak questions. Because in a normal state, most things have a reason to say yes. A stronger question is one that makes many choices automatically fall away. If this opportunity disappeared right now, would I actively pursue it? When I started asking that question, my world completely changed. Many things that once perplexed me suddenly became bland, not because they were bad, but because they weren't good enough. And that's an important difference. Essentialists don't seek what's good, they seek what's truly worthwhile. I learned to set high standards intentionally, not to be picky, but to be honest with my limited energy. I rate every option on a mental scale, most stop at decent. A few reach good, and only very rarely does something make me not need to convince myself. If I have to persuade myself, that's already the answer. The interesting thing is that when you set high standards, saying no becomes easier. You don't need excuses, you don't need justifications. You are simply loyal to the principle you've chosen. Others might not understand, but you understand very clearly what you are protecting. I used to fear that if I chose too carefully, I would miss out, but the opposite was true. When I stopped pursuing things that were just good enough, I started to have space for truly suitable things to appear. Clarity doesn't impoverish life, it makes life more precise. Every time you say no to something not good enough, you are saying yes to something that hasn't appeared yet. There's a very strange feeling when you live with high standards. You're less busy, but not empty. You have fewer opportunities, but each opportunity carries weight. You're not always praised for being flexible, but you are trusted for your consistency. This selectivity doesn't just apply to work, it permeates every corner of life. You choose which conversations deserve your full attention. You choose which relationships are worth nurturing. You choose what is allowed to occupy space in your mind. Energy follows attention. Where you set your standards, your life will follow. When you choose with low standards, you constantly have to correct mistakes. When you choose with high standards, you have to wait. And many people fear waiting more than making mistakes. But only intentional waiting creates decisions that don't need to be regretted. I'm not saying choosing becomes easy. It's still hard. There's still a feeling of missing out. There are still nights wondering if I'm too rigid. But the difference lies here. I no longer regret choosing according to my values. I only regret those times before when I chose merely to avoid awkwardness. Essentialists do not avoid short-term discomfort for the sake of long-term relief. When everything in this section converges, a new order forms. You withdraw to create space. You observe to see clearly. You play and rest to maintain clarity. And finally, you choose with high standards to protect what is essential. That's not a technique. It's a way of life, unpretentious, quiet, yet persistent, consistent, and strong in a very silent way. When you no longer have to ask what to do next, because the standard has answered for you, you know you are living differently, not faster, not more, but more correctly. I realize that after all I've been through, the problem is no longer a lack of understanding or effort. The problem is that we're not clear enough to eliminate. People aren't defeated by big decisions, but are eroded by the hundreds of small decisions they have to make every day. Every hesitation, every trivial consideration, every time you ask, should I or shouldn't I? Energy leaks away a little. And when energy is depleted by things not worth it, we no longer have the strength to protect what's truly important. When the destination is blurry, every path seems right. I lived in that state for a very long time, doing a lot but unsure of what I was building. Nodding to seemingly reasonable requests, busy with things deemed necessary. But the further I went, the more I felt I was going in circles. Not because I wasn't trying, but because I lacked a clear enough core decision to guide me. Only when I forced myself to answer a single question did everything change. What am I trying to create? Not this week, not this month, but over a long enough period to be worth living for. That question was not comfortable. It forced me to confront the fact that many of the things I was doing weren't actually serving what I claimed was important. A clear decision can replace hundreds of ambiguous ones. When the essential is clarified, other things begin to fall away on their own, without debate, without lengthy explanations, without self-persuasion. They simply no longer have a place. Clarity creates a natural filter. Anything that doesn't pass through that filter becomes unreasonably burdensome. I realize that most of the overload in modern life doesn't come from having too many difficult tasks, but from constantly having to make decisions within a hazy frame of reference. When you don't know what you're protecting, you're forced to consider everything. And when everything is considered, you lose your freedom. Unclear goals are the root of overload. Clarifying isn't about writing a flowery manifesto, it's a frank internal act. It demands that you accept that some paths will never be taken, some opportunities will forever be declined. And that's not because they are bad, but because they don't align with what you are protecting. When I started living with a clear core decision, I didn't become rigid. I became lighter. Many questions that used to keep me awake disappeared. Not because I found an answer to each one, but because I no longer needed to ask them. The filter did the work for me. Clarifying isn't about doing more, but about having a valid reason to eliminate. The interesting thing is that when you are clear enough, you no longer need to justify saying no. You don't say no out of selfishness, you say no out of loyalty. Loyalty to what you have chosen as essential. And that loyalty brings a very different kind of steadfastness, not aggressive, not defensive, just certain. I once thought that clarifying would make me lonelier. The opposite was true. It made the remaining relationships more authentic, because when you no longer live in ambiguity, you don't pull others into your confusion. You don't promise things you don't intend to keep. You don't agree just to avoid awkwardness. You are present clearly. And that clarity creates respect. When you don't know where you're going, others will choose your path for you. Clarifying is the act of reclaiming leadership, not loudly, no declarations needed, just enough honesty to look squarely at what no longer fits. And when that happens, elimination is no longer a loss. It becomes a natural consequence of growth. This is the starting point of cutting away not with a knife, but with light. Where the light of clarity shines, the superfluous vanishes. And when you stand firm in this position, the next steps are no longer about what to discard, but whether you have the courage to protect that clarity. Once clarity stands firm, another, much more uncomfortable challenge arises. It's the moment you realize you must act consistently with what you've understood, no longer hiding behind ambiguity, no longer sheltering under good intentions. Only a very real question remains. Do you dare to protect the essential with concrete action? Knowing the right thing has never been the hardest part. The hardest part is daring to reject the wrong thing when it wears a cloak of reasonableness. I once thought saying no was a communication skill. In reality, it's an internal test. Each time we refuse, we touch a very human fear. Fear of displeasing, fear of being misunderstood, fear of missing out, fear of appearing inflexible. And because of these fears, we choose the easier path, nodding, procrastinating, avoiding, only to pull ourselves into commitments that don't belong to us. Every unconsidered nod is a silent rejection of something more important. I once said yes just because I didn't want to disappoint others, and as a result, I disappointed myself. Not immediately, but gradually, bit by bit. When you continuously prioritize others' emotions over your own clarity, you teach yourself that what's essential can be postponed indefinitely. Saying no doesn't need to be harsh, it needs to be precise. Don't apologize for protecting what you believe is right. Don't offer lengthy explanations to seek permission. Just be polite, firm, and consistent. When you say no with calm, others will perceive it not as opposition, but as a boundary. Boundaries don't weaken relationships, they make them clearer. But there's a much harder form of refusal, refusing what you've already agreed to. Projects that have started, commitments where time has been invested, paths already partially walked. At this point, reason is often blinded by a dangerous feeling. It's too late. I've already put in the effort. Quitting now would be such a waste. Continuing a wrong path simply because you've started is the slowest way to move away from the right one. I used to be stuck in such choices, not because I believed in them, but because I feared admitting I had chosen wrong. I called it perseverance, but in reality, it was avoidance. Avoiding looking directly at the fact that for some decisions, the sooner you stop, the smaller the price. Cutting losses isn't losing, it's clarity. It requires more courage than continuing, because when you continue, you can hide behind hope. When you stop, you have to face the truth, and the truth is rarely comfortable. Resilience isn't about enduring to the end. It's about daring to stop at the right time. When I started allowing myself to withdraw from commitments that no longer fit, a strange thing happened. I didn't get weaker, I got lighter. The energy that had been buried in the wrong places was returned. My focus became sharper, and the essential, which had been pushed aside, finally had room to breathe. Many people believe they are stuck. In reality, they are holding themselves back by the fear of judgment, fear of others thinking they are inconsistent, fear of being seen as a failure. But what others truly perceive, if you are consistent enough, is respect, because very few people dare to do it. Every time you cut a wrong commitment, you are opening up a space for a right choice that hasn't appeared yet. Refusal and cutting losses are not two separate actions. They are two sides of the same ability, the ability to protect the essential from social pressure and personal emotions. When you master this ability, Life is no longer a series of passive reactions, it becomes an intentional flow. This point connects very naturally to the next step, because once you've dared to say no and dared to let go, the question is no longer what to discard. The question becomes, how do you keep what remains sharp and concise without letting it swell back up? That's where the art of pruning and setting boundaries begins to take effect. Having dared to say no and dared to let go, a new danger arises, more subtle, yet more persistent. Everything tends to swell back up. Remaining tasks begin to drag on. Small compromises creep back in familiar forms. If not careful, the essential just rescued will be buried again. This time, not by ambiguity, but by habit. Elimination isn't a one-time action, it's a living discipline. I started looking at my life like a manuscript, not to add more, but to edit. That manuscript had too many superfluous sentences, too many redundant paragraphs, too many details kept simply out of familiarity. And like any unedited manuscript, it was verbose but lacked focus. Editing isn't destroying, it's making what's important clear by removing what's unnecessary. When you cut out a superfluous section, you don't impoverish the story, you sharpen it. Life is the same. Everything you keep must answer a very simple question. Does it highlight the essential? The superfluous doesn't just take up space, it dilutes meaning. I realized that much of the pressure in life doesn't come from a lack of ability, but from carrying too many things that no longer fit. Responsibilities kept out of politeness, habits maintained out of inertia, concerns that no longer serve the current direction. If not actively pruned, they silently erode focus. Editing requires continuous alertness. Every time a new task appears, I don't ask if it's good. I ask, does it detract from what's most important? If the answer is yes, even a little, I know I need to consider it very carefully, because the essential doesn't need many things around it to prove its value. What's truly important doesn't need to be crowded. But editing alone isn't enough. Without clear boundaries, all efforts to prune will be eroded. The world doesn't lack people ready to fill your empty spaces, not because they're bad, but because you haven't been clear. A boundary isn't a fence built against others, it's a line that helps others know where to stop. I used to be afraid to set boundaries, thinking it would make me seem cold. The reality is the opposite. When boundaries are clear, relationships become healthier. No more unspoken expectations, no more accumulated resentment, no more feeling encroached upon but not daring to speak out. Without boundaries, the essential will always be the first thing sacrificed. Boundaries protect three things that modern people often lose fastest: time, energy, and attention. When you don't clearly define where these three things belong, others will assume they can use them according to their needs, and you'll call that responsibility, when in reality it's giving up control. I learned to design boundaries not with promises, but with structure, inviolable time blocks, principles that don't need re-explaining, choices already made in advance so as not to negotiate when tired. The most effective boundaries are those that don't need to be debated. Freedom doesn't come from having many choices, but from having few right choices. When editing and boundaries coexist, a new order forms. Life no longer requires constant defense. You don't have to continuously say no because many things no longer reach you. The essential has space to grow, uninterrupted, not pulled off course. At this point, elimination no longer feels like a loss. It feels light. Light because you no longer have to hold on to things that don't belong to you. Light because each day has a clear structure. Light because energy is no longer leaking into places that create no value. Elimination doesn't shrink life, it makes life more precise. When I look back at this entire journey, I see a very clear flow. Clarify to know what you are protecting. Dare to refuse and dare to let go so as not to betray that clarity. Then, edit and establish boundaries to prevent the essential from eroding over time. This isn't a series of techniques, it's a way of living with inner order. And once that order has formed, something interesting happens. Execution is no longer heavy. You don't need to force yourself to do the right thing, you just let the design system guide you. That's when action becomes much lighter. Not because you've become weaker, but because you've eliminated the things that used to distract you. Failure rarely comes from not being good enough. It comes from underestimating unpredictability. We plan for a perfect day, a tidy week, a smooth project. Then, with just one small unexpected event, everything collapses like a domino chain. Not because we're weak, but because we've pushed everything to the edge. Most people don't collapse from major challenges, but from not leaving room for small errors. I used to live that way, always scheduling things tightly, just enough time, just enough energy, just enough resilience. I called it discipline. But in reality, it was a disguised form of fragility. Just one unexpected call, one unforeseen incident, and I immediately entered a crisis management state. No more clarity, no more choices, just reaction. From then on, I started reevaluating how I prepared for life, not by trying harder, but by creating a buffer. Extra time to be late without panicking. Extra energy to make mistakes without collapsing. Extra space to think when things don't go as expected. Preparing with a buffer isn't pessimism, it's respect for reality. The reality is that people get tired sooner than we think, plans deviate more than we anticipate, and the world rarely operates exactly as desired. When you create a buffer, you don't just protect your plan. You protect your own clarity, because only when you're not pushed against a wall do you still have the ability to choose correctly. I used to meet people who were always in a rush. They spoke fast, decided fast, promised fast, but also tired fast. They had no buffer, so every hiccup became a crisis. And after living in that state for a long time, people become accustomed to reacting instead of leading. Someone without a buffer always lives according to the schedule of emergencies. I started applying a very simple principle. For anything important, I prepare more than necessary, not to be lazy, but to avoid being forced into poor quality decisions when things get stressful. I allow extra time, I lower expectations. I leave unnamed empty spaces in my schedule. Initially, it felt like I was wasting time. But over time, I clearly saw the advantage. While others were in chaos due to changes, I stood firm. While others hastily patched things up, I could pause and choose. The difference wasn't in talent, but in who had the buffer to think when things went off rhythm. The buffer is the unfair advantage of the essentialist. This isn't just true for time, but also for energy and emotions. If you constantly deplete all your energy on things that are just important enough, you'll have nothing left for moments that truly require courage. If you always react with tense emotions, you'll lose the flexibility to adjust your direction. I learned not to push myself to the limit, not to force myself to operate at maximum capacity continuously. Because I understand that endurance doesn't come from running at full speed, but from knowing when to conserve strength. The people who go the furthest aren't the fastest at the start, but the ones who are least exhausted along the way. A plan without a buffer is a fragile plan. When you have eliminated the superfluous in previous steps, what remains deserves to be protected, and protected not by rigidity, but by intelligent preparation. The buffer allows the essential not to be compromised every time an unexpected event occurs. It keeps you from having to sacrifice what's important just for a temporary inconvenience. From here, the way of life begins to change. You no longer try to control everything. You accept that you can't control everything. But you can control how you prepare, and that very preparation creates a very different sense of steadiness, not noisy, not ostentatious, but deep and secure. Preparation doesn't slow you down, it keeps you from going off course. When you live with a wide enough buffer, you don't need to be constantly strong. You only need to be clear-headed when necessary, and that clarity will be the foundation for the next step. Because after learning to leave a buffer to avoid collapsing, the natural question will arise. How can the right thing be made easier to do, instead of always forcing yourself to try harder? Once a sufficient buffer exists to prevent collapse, I realized another truth, even harder to accept. Most of what we call discipline is actually just an effort to compensate for a poorly designed environment. We blame ourselves for lacking willpower, while what needs to change are the invisible forces dragging us down every day. Effectiveness rarely comes from pushing yourself harder. It comes from making the right thing easier to do. I used to try to improve myself with promises. I'll focus more. I'll be more diligent. I won't get distracted anymore. But each time I was only fighting against the very environment I created. A cluttered desk, overlapping schedules, small habits that constantly drained my attention. I called it a lack of discipline, but in reality, it was a lack of design. When I stopped blaming myself and started observing, everything became clear. The most important thing isn't how strong you are, but how many obstacles you have to overcome to do the right thing. If every right action requires great effort, you won't be able to sustain it long term. Not because you're weak, but because humans aren't meant to constantly strain themselves. If the essential is always difficult to do, it will soon be abandoned. I started asking a different question before every difficulty. What is hindering me? Not, what am I lacking? But, where am I getting stuck? And when I looked in that direction, the solution was no longer to try harder, but to remove obstacles. Remove the small but persistent barriers, remove the seemingly harmless habits that erode willpower, remove the structures that make every day a struggle. I rearranged my workspace, eliminated things that didn't serve what was most important, simplified intermediate steps, reduced the number of decisions I had to make. Each change was small, but cumulatively, they made doing the right thing require less effort than before. I no longer needed to remind myself to focus. The environment did that for me. When friction decreases, discipline becomes lighter. Many people believe that to live well, we must become stronger. I believe the opposite. To live right, we need to be smarter in how we clear the path. Essentialists don't win through persistent willpower, but by not putting themselves in unnecessary battles. I see this very clearly in small moments. When the important task is placed in the most accessible position, when distractions are moved far away, when habits are designed to be easier to start than to finish. Every detail is a silent reminder. No encouragement needed, no forcing needed, just the right structure. Don't ask how to try harder, ask how to make it less difficult. When I changed this approach, I no longer had to struggle with myself as much as before. Energy was devoted to creating value, not fighting the environment. I didn't need to win every day, I just needed not to make it difficult for myself. This naturally connects with the buffer mentioned earlier. The buffer helps you not collapse during unforeseen events, while removing friction helps you not get tired when there are no unforeseen events. One protects clarity in a crisis, the other protects resilience in everyday life. Both serve the same goal, to ensure the essential can continue to exist without continuous sacrifice. Effort should be the last resort, not the main strategy. When you've cleared the path well enough, the right thing begins to happen more naturally. Not perfectly, not absolutely smoothly, but light enough to sustain, clear enough not to be forgotten. And from that lightness, a new rhythm forms, the rhythm of small but steady steps, instead of short bursts of effort followed by exhaustion. With friction removed, I began to feel a subtle change. No more intense straining, no more days of burning out then fading away. Instead, a slow, steady movement, seemingly humble but persistent. And here, another truth emerges. People don't get exhausted from moving slowly. People get exhausted from constantly starting over. Progress doesn't need to be big. Progress needs to be consistent. I used to be obsessed with leaps and bounds, a single decision changing everything, a breakthrough transforming life. But reality is very different. Big changes rarely endure without a small foundation underneath. They look good at first, then vanish when energy runs out. What remains, in the end, are always small steps, repeated, silent but purposeful. When I stopped seeking explosions, I started appreciating very small signs. A workday ending without exhaustion, an important task progressing a little, a habit maintained even when the mood wasn't right. These things don't create excitement, but they build momentum. And momentum is what carries us far. Motivation isn't born from inspiration. It's born from the feeling of being on the right track. Every small step is proof that you're moving, proof that your efforts aren't wasted. When people see signs of progress, they naturally want to continue. No pushing needed, no iron discipline needed, just the feeling of not standing still. But small steps alone aren't enough. If every day you have to decide again from scratch, you'll soon get tired. Here, rhythm begins to play a decisive role, not the rhythm of excitement, but the rhythm of habit. Habits don't make you more special, they make you more stable. And that stability is what protects the essential from emotional fluctuations. Every decision eliminated is a unit of energy preserved. I don't build habits to force myself to do more. I build habits so I don't have to think too much. When the important thing has a fixed place in my day, I don't need to negotiate with myself every morning, don't need to ask myself if I should do it today. That question has already been answered in advance. Many people misunderstand habits. They think of them as soulless repetition. For me, habits are a higher form of freedom. They free the mind from trivial decisions to devote attention to things that truly require thought. When you don't have to make continuous decisions, you don't get worn down. Habits keep what's important from being pushed aside by temporary emotions. I realize that the people who go the furthest aren't those who are always full of energy. They are the ones who know how to design their days so they don't need too much energy. They don't wait for inspiration. They integrate important tasks into their daily rhythm, where they are protected by structure, not by willpower. Small steps create momentum, habits maintain direction. These two things combined create a stable flow, not noisy, not dramatic, but very difficult to derail. And it's that flow that allows you to move forward even on the most ordinary days, days where nothing special happens, days you used to give up. You don't need a perfect day, you need many good enough days. When I look back at the periods when I made the most progress, they weren't linked to emotional highs. They were linked to consistent stretches of days, a little each day, no one applauding, no one witnessing. But after a while, the distance was created not by strength, but by rhythm. Amidst the many things happening in the day at this moment, what is truly important, not important in general, but important right now asterisk. That's where focus becomes discipline, and this entire journey begins to close into a more complete way of life. The rhythm is stable. When small steps no longer need to be reminded, a more subtle challenge arises. It's no longer the question of how to do many right things, but how not to lose the right thing amidst countless things happening simultaneously. Because even after eliminating, clearing the path, building habits, distraction always lurks. The problem isn't that you don't know what's important. The problem is that you forget it precisely when you need to remember. I used to believe that having clear goals was enough. But in real life, goals are easily obscured by small things that appear urgent. A message arriving just as you're concentrating, a seemingly reasonable request, an unexpected issue not in the plan. Little by little, attention is pulled off course, not loudly, not dramatically, just a gentle drift. I began to realize that focus isn't an emotional state. It's a choice, continuously repeated, not a choice for the whole day, but for each moment. And that choice needs a question sharp enough to cut through all the noise. Right now, what is most important? This question doesn't seek a perfect answer. It seeks an answer relevant to the present. Not the most important thing in life, not the most important thing of the year, but in this moment asterisk, with asterisk this energy, in this context asterisk. When you return to that question often enough, your attention begins to gain order. I don't try to stay focused all day. I only try to return to the right point whenever I realize I've drifted. No blaming, no self-judgment, just simply returning, like a breath that wanders and then returns. Sustainable focus is built by such returns, not by a strenuous, prolonged effort. Focus isn't about not being distracted. Focus is about knowing how to return quickly. When this question becomes a habit, I'm no longer pulled too far off course. I still get interrupted, things still arise, but I don't let them dictate my direction. I read aside each time, and gradually, the essential no longer needs to be protected by effort. It's protected by the structure of attention. At this point, I understood that this was no longer a method for being more productive. It had become a way of life. I no longer had to strive to be selective. I lived that way, not perfectly, not absolutely, but consistently. This isn't something you do when you have time. This is the person you become over time. When you live according to the essential for long enough, the right choices begin to come faster. Not because you're smarter, but because you're less distracted. You don't need to weigh everything. Many things automatically remove you from the game because they no longer resonate with your internal criteria. I no longer sought the feeling of control. I sought the feeling of alignment between what I do and the person I am becoming. When those two things align, life no longer needs so much effort to operate. It's not easy, but it's streamlined. And that streamlining creates a very strange kind of freedom, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom not to be pulled away by things that don't belong to you. Living essentially doesn't make you less. It makes you more correct. When I look back at this entire journey, I see it didn't start by doing more, but by daring to choose less. It didn't end with accomplishing more, but with becoming someone who no longer needs to prove themselves through busyness. Everything else was just a consequence: the buffer to not collapse, the cleared path to not get tired, small steps to not give up, rhythm to not lose direction, and the question to always return to the right place. What remains isn't a to-do list. What remains is a life with inner order, where each day carries weight, not because you do a lot, but because you do the right thing. As this journey concludes, what remains is not a list of methods, nor a set of rules to memorize. What remains is a different way of looking at your own life. This book doesn't teach you to do more. It teaches you to dare to do less, but to do it with your full presence. It doesn't advise you to be busy and organized. It forces you to confront a much harder question. What in your life is truly worth trading for this limited time, energy, and attention? The greatest lesson isn't in the techniques of selection, elimination, or organization. It lies in a very human paradox. The more we try to hold on to everything, the more we lose ourselves. Only by daring to let go of less can we keep what's most important. Living essentially doesn't shrink life, it makes life clearer. And that clarity brings a deeper form of freedom than any artificial sense of busyness. Perhaps after listening to this, you don't need to change immediately, clear your schedule, or declare anything grand. Just honestly ask yourself one profound question. Of all that occupies your life, what truly deserves to stay? And what are you holding on to just out of habit, fear, or not daring to say no? If you had to choose again from the beginning, would you continue living as you are now, or would you choose differently, not to become more perfect, but to become truer to yourself? If these thoughts resonate with you, please leave a comment sharing what in your life feels most overwhelming, or what you wish to let go of but haven't found the courage for. If you wish to continue these conversations, please follow the channel so we can delve deeper into the important questions that busy lives often avoid. Sometimes, just one timely conversation, one deep enough perspective, can change how we live the rest of our days. Thank you for listening.